So, welcome. This is Brian and Rhonda, and we're here to talk a little bit about Agile Portfolio Management. So, for our discussion of Agile Portfolio Management, I thought we'd start by looking at just a traditional definition of what portfolio management is all about. So, in portfolio management, you're trying to actually translate the strategy and objectives for the future into a list of valuable elements to achieve those objectives. What do you think, Rhonda?
Right. So you're taking something at the top, the strategy, and you're using that to guide the definition of the activity and work that happens. So this is very top down. You start with a strategy and break it down from there. People have a tendency, and companies have a tendency to do the bottoms up, where they're grouping things together because they think there's a relationship across the work or in a group of work. But really, if you're trying to implement a strategy, you always got to start at the top, and everything has to line up to that.
That makes perfect sense. Because if you're not lining up to those things at the top, you'll never be sure you can make it. And so you're absolutely right. I think we want to break down those elements, those valuable elements. And so when I actually start at my mission and vision and look at the gap between them, I end up developing these strategic objectives. And those objectives are big things. They may take 3 years to actually accomplish. And I want to break those down into smaller pieces so I know if I'm on track. So I break those down into initiatives. And initiatives may last a year. And for each one of those initiatives, see, it's not the initiative I want, it's really the outcome. It's these benefits that I want from it, the result. And so I want to break down these initiatives and really define what those outcomes are. And everything I do from those outcomes, I ought to figure out what's the value to the customers and make sure that those things are aligned. Because again, it's alignment to our strategy that gets us where we're going, toward our mission, toward our vision. And so I got to make sure I identify that value. What do you think, Rhonda?
Yeah, I hear the question all the time is, how do you take a strategy and decide how to execute it? What do you do with strategy? And this is really breaking that down, where you're taking that, coming up with a set of initiatives to do, and then focused on those outcomes. And it's outcomes that you want, not outputs. And there's a big difference. And a lot of times people get confused and focus on the outputs at this layer, where that becomes a checklist of deliverables. But that checklist of deliverables might not achieve the outcomes that you need. So you really need to focus on the outcomes and the value that they're producing at this level, and make sure you're getting the right thing.
Absolutely. And you said something really important here. All of this is in this realm of strategy, right? So at a strategy level, my executive team, my leadership ought to be not only discussing the outcomes, but also we ought to discuss what's valuable to the customers. That should be defined up front and spread throughout the organization. And that often gets missed. Now, after you discuss that value to the customer, remember that you don't know everything about the customer. You're making some educated guesses. And those educated guesses are based on assumptions. And so I ought to make sure that for each piece of value, I list out the assumptions and I'm aware of it, because I need to test these assumptions out to see if they're true. If they're not true, I may need to change my strategy. What do you think, Rhonda?
I think this is so critical. People miss this all the time. And in fact, I don't know if most people even realize this, is that there's incomplete information that is available when leaders come up with a strategy. There's assumptions that they're making. And I see this step missed completely, where people forget that these assumptions are really correlated to your risk, and to to reduce the risk or mediate the risk, you have to prove out these assumptions. And I don't see people making this connection. This is a really important piece that needs to be called out.
Absolutely. And one thing I like to think about is the whole subject of lean and eliminating waste. People look at the waste inside of processes, but the bigger waste is doing the wrong thing. And so you want to eliminate the waste based on these improper assumptions, most of all. And so, again, lean is about experimentation. I think that this is true, this assumption that I'm acting upon. And so I test it out, right? That's a big part of the lean movement.
Right. And the earlier and quicker you can get that feedback and decide whether your strategy is working or not working, the faster that you can pivot if you need to and stop wasting your resources on something that's not going to work out.
Now, in order to do that, in order to test out my assumption, lots of times what I want to do to get fast feedback is to figure out what's the minimum amount or minimum set of outputs that are necessary to show customers in order to get that feedback. And so I take the assumptions, I break those down to that minimum set, that minimum viable product, the term that's often used in the industry. And this is what Agile is all about. Really identifying what those assumptions are and figuring out what's the minimum I'm going to build in order to produce it and grab that customer feedback. What do you think, Rhonda?
Yeah. Yeah, this is where the outputs are happening at this level, where you're getting the teams executing and they're producing the outputs. They are producing the checklist of things that need to be done, but you're doing those in an order and making sure that they're doing the ones that are proving out your assumptions, because you need to eliminate that risk. So I see something here, Brian, is that the real value in this whole model is at the top. We're talking about proving out assumptions and proving out the strategy. But what I see happening typically in the industry is people are focused on the third line, which is the agile line and the outputs. I think typically we're seeing people focused on the wrong thing.
That is definitely true and very scary. And here's the thing, I can tell when that happens on a traditional agile project when I see that there's no sprint goal. Because your sprint goal should be proving out either one assumption or at least a piece of that assumption every sprint. And if you're not focused on that piece and that's not our goal, you're never going to make the tie to the strategy. You're just focused on building things really fast.
Right. So what happens, Brian, if we have some complete data and we haven't had to make assumptions, maybe there isn't risk around what we're doing, then what?
But so if I'm in a situation where there's no risk and I don't need assumptions, I'd be better off not doing agile. If I use a defined approach, I can actually plan things out and plan it out in a way that is not wasteful, that doesn't have uh, any sub optimization, and I can get my projects and my initiative done faster and cheaper. So, no risk. I shouldn't use agile. I should use traditional waterfall approaches. What do you think?
I think you're right. I think doing that last line and the method that you use really depends on the assumptions and the risks that are there in front of you that you have to prove out. If if you're building something that's straightforward and you know how to do it, Agile is probably not the way to go. And that's in pretty much a contradiction to what you see happening in the industry, where everybody seems to think that Agile should be the focus and should be solving all their problems.
You're absolutely right. I think that, again, it goes back to that key word I just heard you say was focus. I think we're focused on the wrong thing sometime in the industry. We want these outputs are tangible, so we think that's the biggest deal. But the big deal where I get the value is really, like you said, is up here at the strategy level. It's making sure that I'm actually building the right things and I'm being effective rather than focusing on being efficient.
Hmm, that's a great point. Being effective is much more valuable than being efficient, because you're at a higher level, you're at a more important level. If you don't have the strategy right and being effective, no matter how efficient you are, you may not succeed. That's
Well,
a great point, Brian.
I'll tell you, I've learned something from this discussion, and I hope the people that are viewing this have learned something too.
Yeah, I think we've said some very interesting things today. Looking forward to more of these.
Well, we're going to sign off for now, but we hope that you stay tuned for additional sessions, and we'll see you soon.